It is almost 10 p.m. on January the 17th, 1961. In the dense bushes of Katanga, a southeastern province in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Police Commissioner Franz Verschoor guides a local force. His orders are clear: dispose of the bodies of Patrice Lumumba, the recently ousted Prime Minister of the Congo, and 2 others in a shallow trench. Out of habit, Verschoor glances at his watch, noting the time of the execution: 9:43 p.m. Beads of sweat trickle down his face, drenching his hands with a sticky film. Though he cannot see it, he knows that it is blood. How did the blood of the Congo's leading politician end up on my hands? He ponders. Suddenly, the headlights illuminating the gruesome scene flicker off, enveloping everything in absolute darkness. On the 18th of October 1908, the Belgian parliament voted to annex the Congo as a Belgian colony, putting an end to King Leopold II's brutal 23-year reign, a reign which saw the population of the Congo cut in half. However, with the Belgian government taking control, the circle of brutal exploitation and violence persisted, albeit to a lesser extent. The colony was overseen by a governor-general and initially divided into 4 provinces, but a reform in 1932 expanded the provinces to 6, each governed by a provincial governor. The provinces were Leopoldville on the west coast, Equator to the north, Oriental to the northeast, Kivu to the east, Kasai in the country's center, and Katanga in the southeast, which had a more intricate administrative structure. In the 1940s and 50s, urbanization swept across the Congo, resulting in a remarkable expansion of the wage labor force, surpassing that of any other African colony. This rapid urbanization gave rise to a burgeoning middle class of Europeanized Africans, known as the Evolues. Although there are no universal criteria for defining the status of an Evolue, individuals with some form of post-primary education, a strong command of the French language, and adherence to Christianity and European values often qualify. In 1957, Ghana achieved the historic milestone by becoming the first independent nation in Black Africa. Subsequently, France made preparations to grant independence to all of its African colonies. These events ignited ambition in the Congo, particularly amongst the Evolues. As they mingled and shared ideas, discussing the vision of a post-colonial Congolese state, nationalism began to brew. Soon, various parties and groups began to emerge, but they were broadly divided along ethnic and geographic lines. Among the earliest organizations was the Alliance of Bakongo, Abaco, led by Joseph Kasavubu. Initially a cultural association, it served as the primary ethno-religious organization for the Bakongo people. However, in the mid-1950s, Abaco transformed into a strong voice against Belgian colonialism. Whilst Kasavubu's Abaco insisted on immediate independence and emphasized ethnic determinism, the Congolese national movement, the MNC, advocated for a gradual approach, striving to establish a unified and centralized Congolese nation. Led by the charismatic Patrice Lumumba, the MNC became the largest and the most influential force dedicated to achieving independence. Another influential nationalist party at the time was the African Solidarity Party, the PSA, led by Antoine Gizenga. It maintained close ties with the MNC and did not align itself with any specific ethnic group. Advocating for a federalist state and provincial autonomy of Katanga was the Confederation of Tribal Associations of Katanga, CONACAT. It was led by a Katangese businessman by the name of Moise Chombe. However, Konakat faced formidable opposition in northern Katanga in the form of the Balubakat party led by Jason Sendwe. On the 28th of December 1958, Patrice Lumumba organized a successful rally for the MNC in Leopoldville, the country's capital. Lumumba, who had recently attended the All African People's Conference in Ghana, brought significance to the gathering. Wary of being overshadowed by Lumumba and the MNC, Kasavubu of the Abaco decided to hold his own event a week later. He requested permission to use the prestigious Young Men's Christian Association building in Leopoldville for the meeting, but the municipal government, given the short notice, only authorized a private gathering. Furthermore, the officials warned the party leaders that they would be held accountable if the event turned political. However, on the day of the rally, a large crowd gathered at the building only to discover that the authorities had banned the event. Following this, Kasavubu and other Abaco officials made desperate attempts to send the protesters home, but they failed to quell the growing unrest. Soon, violence erupted and rocks were hurled at the police, whilst white motorists faced relentless attacks. As the rioters entered the European section of the capital, they looted and set fire to numerous European storefronts, passionately chanting the words, "Indépendance immédiate." Finally, order was restored after the government deployed its colonial army, the Force Publique. Consequently, Kasavubu and other Abaco leaders were arrested. The Leopoldville riots marked a turning point in the Congolese liberation movement, as it was the first time that the desire for an independent nation was passionately expressed not only by the educated Evolués, but also by the largely uneducated masses. This development caught the Belgian authorities off guard, compelling them to confront the profound challenges gripping the colony. The arrest of the Abaco leaders put the MNC in a favorable political position. However, they soon encountered a significant challenge that threatened to undermine their newfound advantage. Discontent arose within the MNC among some members who grew uneasy with Lumumba's control over the party and his seemingly moderate beliefs. Spearheading this movement were Albert Kelonji and Joseph Eleo. They advocated for a more radical approach focused on federalism as opposed to Lumumba's vision of a strong centralized state. Soon, relations between Lumumba and Kelonji grew tense, and as a result, in July 1959, the MNC broke into two factions. The MNC Lumumba, led by Patrice Lumumba, and MNC Kelonji, led by Albert Kelonji. Despite the split, Lumumba's faction continued to rapidly gain support, forging alliances with other regional groups. However, in October 1959, Lumumba would be arrested for inciting a riot that resulted in the deaths of 20 people at a rally in the country's eastern city of Stanleyville. Following the riots in Leopoldville, the security situation across the country continued to deteriorate. Facing immense pressure and fearing the escalation of a colonial war, the Belgian government took action. They organized a roundtable conference in Brussels, inviting leaders from all major Congolese parties to participate in discussions about the nation's political future. The meeting outlined the future of the Belgian Congo and set the date for its independence as the 30th of June 1960, with elections scheduled to be held a month prior. But while a resolution was passed for the organizational structure of the state, crucial matters such as federalism, ethnicity, and Belgium's future involvement in the Congo remained unresolved. Patrice Emery Lumumba was released in time to join the Congolese delegation. Accompanying him was a relatively unknown sergeant who would later become a dictator. This sergeant was a man by the name of Joseph Desire Mobutu. The general elections to the Congo took place on the 22nd of May 1960, and Lumumba's MNCL emerged victorious, winning the majority of seats. Consequently, Lumumba became the prime minister and Joseph Kasavubu from the Abaco, who ranked third in the polls, assumed the presidency. Furthermore, Antoine Gizenga from the PSA was appointed as the deputy prime minister. On the 30th of June 1960, the Congo became an independent nation. During the independence ceremony, King Baudouin of Belgium delivered the first speech presenting the end of colonial rule in the Congo as the culmination of Belgium's civilizing mission initiated by King Leopold II. After the king's speech, Joseph Kasavubu, the newly appointed Congolese prime minister, delivered a brief and uncontroversial address expressing gratitude to the king. However, the highlight of the ceremony occurred when Joseph Kasongo, the president of the Congolese Chamber of Deputies, who presided over the event, invited Lumumba to deliver an impromptu speech.
Battant de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juin 1960.
Although the independence of the Congo is being proclaimed today, no Congolese will ever forget that independence was won in struggle. It was filled with tears, fire, and blood. We have experienced forced labor in exchange for pay that did not allow us to satisfy our hunger. Morning, noon, and night, we were subjected to insults and blows because we were Negroes. Who will ever forget the shootings that killed so many of our brothers, or the cells into which many who no longer wish to submit to the regime of injustice, oppression, and exploitation were thrown? Today, the Republic of the Congo has been proclaimed, and the future of our beloved country is now in the hands of its people. I call on all Congolese citizens, men, women, and children, to set themselves resolutely to the task of creating a national economy and ensuring our economic independence. Eternal glory to the fighters for national liberation. Long live independence and African unity. Long live the independent and sovereign Congo.
Lumumba's speech ignited a standing ovation from the audience. He had just eloquently articulated the heartfelt aspirations of his people. Although the speech was well received in the Congo, it faced widespread international condemnation for being unnecessarily confrontational and showing ingratitude towards Belgium. Seemingly disgusted by what he had just heard, King Baudouin stormed out of the room, only to return after receiving assurance that Lumumba would provide further remarks to clarify his intentions. Finally, the ceremony concluded when the representatives of both countries signed the official Act of Independence. The 30th of June fell on a Thursday, and with it came the long weekend of festivities in the month of July. Throughout this period, the Congolese army, the First Republic, maintained law and order. However, little did they know that a chain of events was about to unfold that will forever alter the destiny of this newly independent nation. For a long time, the Congolese army had been characterized by racial segregation, which persisted even after independence. Many black soldiers had assumed that independence would bring about immediate social change, so they resented the continued presence of Belgians in important positions. To address this issue, the Congolese cabinet convened on the 4th of July to discuss army reform. Meanwhile, at Camp Leopold II, the primary installation in Leopoldville, some Congolese officers started exhibiting acts of indiscipline. They believed that as the Congo had gained independence, they were no longer obligated to follow the orders of their Belgian commanders. At about 5 p.m. on the 4th of July, General Ewans, the commander-in-chief of the First Republic, arrived and confined the undisciplined soldiers to a holding cell. Ewans who had become aware of the government's intention to establish a committee to reorganize the army, was outraged at not being consulted. In response to the growing unrest amongst the Congolese ranks, he summoned all troops on duty at Camp Leopold II. During the meeting, he wrote on a blackboard, "Before independence equals after independence," to underscore that Belgian officers will continue to lead the army even after independence. This greatly angered the Congolese soldiers. That evening, in protest against Ewans, they looted the camp's canteen. In response, Ewans contacted the reserve garrison of Camp Hardy, located 95 miles away in Tillsville, and requested a convoy to be sent to Camp Leopold II to restore order. However, the officers at Camp Hardy mutinied and took control of the armory. The next morning, these soldiers drove from Tillsville to Nkisi, Mandiba and Banzamboma, spreading the mutiny in the process. Meanwhile, Ewans finalized plans to attack Camp Hardy and informed the commander of the Belgian metropolitan troops in the Congo, but the government countermanded his order and instead dispatched Sergeant Joseph Mobutu and other top officials to negotiate with the mutineers. Subsequently, on the 7th of July, the Congolese government began formal negotiations with the mutineers and focused on the Africanization and reorganization of the army. The severity of the mutiny had convinced them that radical reform was necessary to maintain the army's discipline. To appease the mutinous troops, Lumumba dismissed Ewans and promoted all black soldiers by at least one rank. The army was also officially renamed the Armée Nationale Congolaise, ANC. In addition, Lumumba appointed General Victor Lundula, a World War II veteran, as the army's commander-in-chief, and Colonel Joseph Mobutu as the army's chief of staff. However, both appointments were ill-advised as Lundula lacked the necessary qualifications to oversee a modern army, and Lumumba made a grave mistake regarding Mobutu. His overconfidence in commanding the loyalty of those around him led him to disregard credible rumors about Mobutu's ties to Belgian and American intelligence services. By appointing Mobutu to such a critical position, Lumumba unwittingly chose his own Judas. 2 days later, the government delegations left the capital to oversee the Africanization of the ANC. Whilst Mobutu traveled to the Equator province, Kasavubu and Lumumba went directly to Matadi, where tensions were rapidly escalating. In the provinces of Kivu and Oriental, European officers smoothly transferred control to the Congolese without incidents. However, in Katanga, the government's decision to Africanize the army created anxiety among the European population, who feared that such a reform would lead to the collapse of domestic security. As a result, the provincial government in Katanga refused to support the Africanization efforts and directly appealed to Belgium to intervene and resolve the situation. Meanwhile, in Brussels, reports of conflicts and abuses against the Europeans intensified public pressure on the Belgian government to take action. By mid-July, an undisclosed number of Europeans, particularly Belgians, had been killed. Belgian Prime Minister Gaston Eskings grew deeply concerned about the situation, especially when many Belgian civilians started to seek refuge in neighboring countries. In response to these challenges, he sent 2 Belgian officers to Leopoldville,
Kanshof van der Meerswalte and August de Schrijver.
Since both Lumumba and Kasavubu were absent at the time, the officials met with Deputy Prime Minister Antoine Gizenga. They issued an ultimatum to the Prime Minister, formally requesting Belgian military assistance from the Congolese government. They also warned that if their request was ignored, the metropolitan troops would take independent action to safeguard Belgian citizens. When Lumumba and Kasavubu learned about the planned Belgian intervention, it greatly disturbed them. They knew that the Belgian government would not provide guarantees regarding respect for Congolese sovereignty, and as a result, they subsequently requested the withdrawal of all Belgian troops from Congolese soil. But regardless, Belgium's decision to intervene ultimately prevailed. At approximately 6 a.m. on July the 10th, Belgian metropolitan troops from Kema flew to Elizabethville, the capital of the Katanga province, and occupied the local airport. That evening, news of the Belgian intervention reached Lumumba, and he did not hide his frustration.
We have just learned that the Belgian government has sent troops to the Congo and that they have intervened. We protest bitterly against these measures which prejudice good relations between our countries. We appeal to all Congolese to defend our republic against those who threaten it.
Before the end of the day, the Belgians launched a second intervention, this time in the city of Leopold, Kasai. This prompted Lumumba and Kasavubu to visit the town the following day. However, despite the Belgian intervention, the crisis in this newly independent nation had only just begun. In Katanga, the Belgians had now established a foothold and began to disarm and expel all non-Katangese soldiers from the province. Then, on the evening of July the 11th, CONACAT leader and provincial president of Katanga, Moise Tshombe, declared the secession of Katanga from the rest of the Congo.
Vu que nous n'avons pas la confiance au gouvernement qui vient d'être constitué à Leopoldville et présidé par M. Lumumba, nous avons pris comme décision de déclarer l'indépendance du Katanga.
Fatigued by the central government's nationalist ideas, Tshombe viewed the Katangese as separate from the rest of the Congo and condemned Lumumba's dictatorship, labeling him a communist. When news of the Katangese secession reached Lumumba and Kasavubu, they flew to the province to examine the situation for themselves. But upon arrival, the president and prime minister were met by a surprising turn of events. The Katangese Minister of Interior, Godefroid Monongo, refused them permission to land at the airport. He boldly stated that whilst Kasavubu could visit if he pleased, Lumumba was forbidden from entering the territory. Fuming with anger, the president and the prime minister had no choice but to retreat. Tshombe had now consolidated power and disbanded the ANC from Katanga. With the backing of Belgium, he formed his private military force, the Katangese Gendarmerie, and placed them under the authority of Belgian officers. Tshombe's secession was fueled in part by the Katangese longing to hoard the wealth from their lucrative mining operation, denying the rest of the Congo its share. The Belgian mining company Union Minière du Haut-Katanga had exclusive right to Katanga's copper mines. Largely owned by Société Générale de Belgique, a powerful holding company in Brussels with close ties to the Belgian government, the UMHK played a significant role in the rebellion. To aid Tshombe's secession efforts, they provided him with an advance of 1.25 billion Belgian francs, equivalent to approximately $25 million in 1960, or a staggering $256 million in today's currency. However, even within the newfound state of Katanga, unity remained elusive. In the province's northern districts, the Baluba population fiercely resisted Tshombe's secession. Led by J.C. Sendwe, the leader of the Balubakat party, they flatly rejected Tshombe's overtures to join the rebel government, choosing instead to align with the government in Leopoldville. Assigned the post of Katanga State Commissioner, Sendwe valiantly strove to restore the central government's control over Katanga. However, his efforts ultimately fell short. On July the 12th, Lumumba sent a telegram to the Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, emphasizing the need to address Belgian military aggression in his country and their overt support for the Katangese secession. As a result, on the 14th of July, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 143, demanding a complete withdrawal of Belgian troops from the Congo and replacing them with a multinational peacekeeping force under UN command. And so, one of the largest UN peacekeeping missions, the United Nations Operation in the Congo, ONOC, was created. Initially, Lumumba and the central government welcomed the UN troops. However, a swift disagreement soon erupted when the Prime Minister demanded that the UN troops be used to suppress the Katanga secession. The altercation stemmed from Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, which limited ONOC's mandate to maintain law and order within the Congo. The UN regarded Katanga secession as an internal affair and refrained from intervening to uphold Congolese sovereignty. Disagreements over what the UN troops could and could not do would continue throughout ONOC's deployment. On July the 22nd, Lumumba embarked on a critical trip that took him to Washington to solicit support from the United States. Unfortunately for him, the US refused to support his cause and took the position that all assistance from the states would be channeled through the United Nations.
The position of the United States government on this point is unequivocally clear for itself and for others. Despite an official request from the government of the Congo some days ago for United States troops, we insisted that all American help be channeled through the United Nations.
After failing to secure support from the major Western powers, Lumumba returned to Leopoldville. However, upon his arrival, Albert Kalonji, the leader of the MNCK, declared the independence of the southern part of the Kasai province located slightly north of Katanga. Centered around the city of Bakwanga, he calls it the mining state of South Kasai. Kalonji claimed that the Baluba people in the Kasai region had long been persecuted and needed a state in their traditional homeland. He appoints Joseph Ngalula as prime minister, but the relationship between the two would start to deteriorate and Ngalula would go into exile the following year. Kalonji also garnered support from none other than Belgium. Like Katanga, the region of South Kasai had important mineral deposits and housed another Belgian mining company called Forminia. As a result, the secession of both Katanga and South Kasai now deprived the central government of approximately 40% of the Congo's revenue. Frustrated by the Western powers' refusal to help cool the rebellion, Lumumba sought support from the Soviet Union. This move confirmed the suspicion of the US government, as they had previously seen him as a communist, and so Lumumba had now positioned himself as an enemy of the United States. Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief in the Congo, described the following events as
a classic communist takeover.
In the end, the Soviets supplied weapons, logistics and material support and dispatched around 1,000 military advisors to the Congo. Consequently, in late August, Lumumba took a decisive action intending to launch a significant offensive against South Kasai before proceeding to recapture Katanga. Fueled by Soviet support, a vanguard of Congolese army flew to the Kasai region on August the 23rd. With reinforcements from a garrison at Loloaborg, they began advancing into South Kasai. The following day, Kalonji departed for Katanga to seek assistance from Shombe, but that very night, the ANC troops entered South Kasai territory and faced minimal opposition from the ill-equipped and poorly trained Kasayan soldiers. In the end, they successfully captured the capital city of Bakwanga on August the 26th. However, lacking supplies and adequate transportation, the soldiers resorted to seizing civilian vehicles and food from the Baluba natives in preparation for an advance on Katanga. These soldiers then carried out a series of massacres against the Baluba population. The scale of the violence was so extensive that a small Tunisian ONOC detachment in Bakwanga proved incapable of containing it. South Kasayan soldiers were forcibly removed from hospitals and executed, while civilians attempting to flee to remote neighboring villages were pursued and killed. As a result, about 3,000 civilians lost their lives and tens of thousands were compelled to seek refuge in neighboring regions. The massacres in Bakwanga triggered international condemnation, leading the United Nations Secretary General to describe them as
a case of incipient genocide.
Meanwhile, in Katanga, Kalonji organized a new army to retake South Kasai. With the assistance of the Katangese troops, they launched a counter-offensive in the town of Luputa. When they entered the town, Kalonji's troops began to indiscriminately murder the civilian population. Their counter-offensive was eventually stopped by the ANC. However, with the help of the Katangese gendarmerie, the Kasayan troops managed to successfully repel the ANC's incursions into Katanga. Throughout August, President Kasavubu grew increasingly concerned about Lumumba's growing authoritarianism and the escalating prospects of a civil war in the Congo. Furthermore, his relationship with the Prime Minister has significantly deteriorated. As a result, on the 5th of September 1960, he announced the dismissal of Lumumba, Deputy Prime Minister Othen Gizenga, and 5 other ministers over the radio. He then appointed Joseph Ilio, the President of the Senate, as the Prime Minister and entrusted him with the task of forming a new government. When the news reached Lumumba, he took to the radio to defend his government and in return deposed Kasavubu. He argued that Kasavubu had not obtained the approval of any responsible minister, rendering his actions legally invalid. Fearing that Lumumba might fly in loyal troops from Stanleyville to regain control of the capital and ignite a civil war, the ONUC commander stationed in Leopoldville ordered the UN troops to close the airport. Eventually, the Congolese parliament convened to address the issues and voted to invalidate the declarations of dismissal made by Kasavubu and Lumumba. Regardless, on the 10th of September, Ilio proclaimed his complete government. Kasavubu then ordered the army to detain Lumumba, but General Victor Lundula refused to arrest him. As a result, the president dismissed him and appoints Colonel Joseph Mobutu as the new army chief. Now the commander-in-chief of the Congolese army, Mobutu had grown to be very influential. To the shock of the entire Congolese populace, particularly President Kasavubu, Mobutu effectively carried out a coup on the 14th of September and announced the dismissal of the president, the respective governments of Ilio and Lumumba, and the parliament until the end of the year. Additionally, he ordered all Soviet advisors to leave the country and announced the establishment of a college of commissioner generals led by Foreign Minister Justin Bomboko. However, not everyone supported the coup. Maurice Mpolo, the Congolese Minister for Youth and Sports and a staunch supporter of Lumumba, attempted to undermine the coup. As a result, Mobutu arrested him and Deputy Prime Minister Othen Gizenga on September the 23rd. But under pressure from the United Nations, he released them the following day. Later, Gizenga left for Stanleyville. Meanwhile, Lumumba continued to hold meetings with members of the government and political supporters, asserting his continued hold on power. This angered Mobutu, who had now begun to align himself with Kasavubu. Resultingly, Mobutu ordered his troops to surround Lumumba's residence, but a cordon of Ghanaian UN peacekeepers prevented them from carrying out an arrest. And so, Lumumba was effectively placed under house arrest. Towards the end of the year, many supporters of Lumumba began to flee the capital for Stanleyville, where Antoine Gizenga, the deposed deputy prime minister, was establishing a rebel government. Following this, Lumumba resolved to join Gizenga in Stanleyville and lead a campaign to reclaim power. On November the 27th, he departed the capital in a convoy of 9 cars, accompanied by his wife Pauline, his youngest child, and 2 of his ministers,
Remy Mwamba and Pierre Mulele.
Instead of making a swift journey to the border of the Oriental province where Gizenga's loyal soldiers awaited him, Lumumba opted to touring the neighboring villages, resulting in significant delays. Unfortunately, on December the 1st, while attempting to cross the Sankuru River in Lodi, Mobutu's troops, under the command of Gilbert Pierre Pongo, caught up with him. The soldiers promptly captured his wife and child. Refusing to abandon them, Lumumba revealed himself to the troops and was immediately arrested. However, Mulele and Mwamba managed to evade capture. The next day, Lumumba was brought back to Leopoldville and transferred to the Camp Hardy military barracks in Tillsville. Meanwhile, Joseph Okito, another close political ally of Patrice Lumumba, who briefly held the position of the second vice president of the Senate, was also arrested en route to Stanleyville. In addition, Maurice Mpolo had also intended to join Gizenga in Stanleyville. Before his departure, he addressed a crowd of Lumumba supporters, but news of his rally quickly reached Mobutu, who immediately dispatched troops to apprehend him. Mpolo was subsequently transferred to the base in Tillsville, joining Lumumba and Okito.
Patrice Lumumba comes back to Leopoldville a prisoner. The former Congo premier, who was captured when he fled inland, no longer wears the tuft of whiskers on his chin that helped to identify him. His arrest provoked several clashes between Lumumba followers and Congolese army troops. But Congo's strongman, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, shown as he watches Lumumba arrive, says he is prepared to put down any uprising. At the same time, the Soviet Union has been demanding Lumumba's release and immediate talks at the United Nations. Mobutu enjoys the sight of Lumumba being tied up more firmly for transfer to the garrison town of Tillsville. A soldier tries to stuff into Lumumba's mouth a crumpled speech asserting his claim to power. The former premier shows no emotion. It may be the end of a chapter, but not yet the end of the Congo story.
Back in Stanleyville, on December the 12th, Antoine Gizenga announced a new government based in the Oriental province. He called it the Free Republic of the Congo. It immediately garnered support from China and the Soviet Union. Gizenga was also joined by Lumumba's former army commander, General Victor Lundula, who arrived with troops loyal to him. In the early morning of Friday the 13th of January 1961, soldiers stationed at Camp Hardy, where Lumumba and the other 2 were being held, became uncontrollable. They refused to take any orders unless they were paid. Fearing that the soldiers might set Lumumba free, Mobutu, Kasavubu, Foreign Minister Justin Bomboko, and Head of Security Victor Ndeka arrived at the camp and negotiated with the soldiers. It had now become evident that keeping Lumumba in the camp posed too great a risk. To make matters worse, rumors began circulating that Gizenga had begun to prepare troops bound for Leopoldville to release Lumumba. This prompted a decision to transfer Lumumba elsewhere, with Katanga being considered as the primary option. Although no one harbored a stronger animosity towards Lumumba than Albert Kelonji, who now sought revenge after the massacres in South Kasai and would gladly receive him, the authorities were concerned that the Ghanaian UN peacekeeping force stationed at the Bakwangan airport might impede the landing of the plane carrying Lumumba, or worse, attempt a rescue mission. As for Shombe, he had not yet permitted Lumumba in Elizabethville, preferring the Balubakat leader, J.C. Sendwe, who was also in custody at the time. However, after being influenced by Belgium's Minister of African Affairs, Count Herod de Asperemont-Leyden, Tshombe relented and agreed to the plan.
Belgian interests require the final elimination of Lumumba.
Fortunately for Tshombe, the UN peacekeepers stationed at the Elizabethville airport only supervised civilian air traffic, granting Katanga full control over its military transport. As a result, they could not disrupt Lumumba's handover in Katanga. Finally, on January 17, 1961, Lumumba, Okito, and Upolo were flown to Elizabethville. They were brutally beaten on the way. When the aircraft touched down at about 5 p.m., Lumumba found himself facing an impressive array of the Katangese forces. Also amongst them were the highest echelons of the Belgian army. The Katangese police commissioner, a Belgian by the name of Frans Verschoor, who had previously accompanied Lumumba to jail for inciting a riot in Stanleyville, was noticeably absent. He was summoned that afternoon by Tshombe and told to be ready in the evening. Verschoor had now secured a place for Lumumba's detention, an empty bungalow belonging to a farmer by the name of Lucien Broways, which lay 2 miles down the road from the Elizabethville airport. Back at the airport, Captain Julian Gate, a lower-ranking officer and Flemish head of the military police, also the passengers from the plane to a waiting vehicle. Lumumba and the 2 others did not disembark in good shape. Subsequently, the convoy brought the prisoners to the Broways building where the beatings continued. In the meantime, Tshombe and his cabinet were holding a group meeting. Ultimately, they resolved that Lumumba and his 2 accomplices must be eliminated before daybreak. Tshombe and some of his cabinet members then drove to the Broways building. This time, they met with Lumumba and tormented him for the last time. Verschoor had accompanied the African officials but remained outside until 8:30 p.m. However, when Tshombe and his ministers departed, he loaded Lumumba and his accomplices into the back seat of his car. The motorcade then took the road to Jadoville, a distance of 80 miles where Katanga's penitentiary was located. At about 9:30 p.m., they arrived at their destination, somewhere in the middle of the bush. In the darkness, illuminated by the spotlights of military trucks, Captain Julian Gate and Verschoor, along with other Belgian servicemen, issued the fatal orders to the soldiers. Verschoor took the 3 men, one at a time, out of his car. He led Okito, then Umpolo, and finally Lumumba in front of a shallow depression. Each prisoner had a firing squad of 4 men. While they shot Okito, Verschoor screened the 2 others and said,
"It will soon be over. Say your last prayers."
He then handed over Umpolo, who made the sign of the cross, dropped to his knees, and spoke,
Our Father, who hath in heaven, hallowed be thy...
The shots came in the middle of his prayer. Verschoor was now alone, screening Lumumba, and said to him,
"Please forgive them and say your prayers."
But Lumumba did not speak. He remained silent from beginning until the end. One by one, their bodies were rolled into a pit and buried. Subsequently, Katangan Interior Minister Godefroid Monongo, not wanting a burial site for the bodies, oversaw a final solution. He ordered members of the execution team, led by a Belgian gendarmerie officer, by the name of Gerard Soit to dig up their remains and eliminate all traces. Without displaying any sign of remorse, Soit and his men took 2 oversized glass containers filled with sulfuric acid and a large barrel made of acid-resistant metal and dissolved the corpses in them. The ordeal took 2 days and nights to complete.
He had good strong teeth, so I kept them as a souvenir. We did things an animal would not do.
Then, on February the 13th, Munongo announced to the press that the villagers in the bush had captured and killed the 3 men. However, he did not disclose the location of the incident or where the 3 men had been laid to rest.
I'm going to speak frankly and bluntly as I usually do. We shall be accused of having murdered them. My reply is, prove it.
At the announcement of Lumumba's death, furious protests took place around the world. In a blistering rebuke, the Soviet Union blamed the imperial powers and called for the United Nations to leave the Congo. Indeed, the Cold War influenced Belgian and American acuity on Lumumba. For seeking Soviet support, they feared Lumumba's increasing susceptibility to communist influence. However, it remains a fact that Lumumba appealed to the Kremlin only as a last resort after the UN and the United States refused to help him. In the late 20th and 21st century, investigations have been conducted into Lumumba's assassination. In a 1999 interview on a Belgian television, Soit presented a bullet and 2 teeth that he claimed to have preserved from Lumumba's body. Furthermore, a 2001 report also uncovered several plots by the United States and Belgium to assassinate Lumumba. Among them was a CIA-sponsored attempt to poison him. In 2020, Lumumba's daughter appealed to King Philippe of Belgium to return her father's suit, describing him as a hero without a grave. Consequently, on the 20th of June 2022, Lumumba's gold tooth was returned to the Congo and buried on the exact day marking the 62nd anniversary of Congo's independence.
We believe that the only way to keep the Cold War out of the Congo is to keep the United Nations in the Congo. And we call on the Soviet Union to join us in thus ensuring the free and untrammeled exercise by the Congolese people of their right to independence and to democracy.
Although the Congo had lost its first prime minister, the crisis was far from over. In the ensuing years, it would witness the United Nations immersing itself in a fierce struggle, fighting relentlessly to safeguard the integrity of the newly independent nation. After the death of Lumumba, Colonel Mobutu reinstated Kasavubu and Joseph Ilio as president and prime minister, respectively. In return, Kasavubu elevated the colonel to the rank of major general. Subsequently, Mobutu executed several Lumumba supporters charged with crimes against the Baluba nation. Amongst them was John Pierre Finot, the first president of the Oriental province. In retaliation, Antoine Gizenga, the former deputy prime minister of the Congo and a staunch supporter of Lumumba, who had now consolidated power in the Oriental province, commanded his soldiers to shoot 15 political prisoners loyal to Mobutu. This group included Alphonse Songolo, the former Minister of Communications, and Gilbert Pierre Pongo, the individual responsible for capturing Lumumba. In February 1961, the Congo had split into 4 factions. Antoine Gizenga's Free Republic of the Congo, centered in Stanleyville, the government of Kasavubu and Mobutu, based in the capital city of Leopoldville, Moise Tshombe's independent state of Katanga, with its capital in Elizabethville, and the government of South Kasai, led by Albert Kelonji and based in the city of Bakwanga. Following the disintegration of the central government and Katanga's continued reliance on foreign mercenaries, the United Nations bolstered and expanded its peacekeeping force across the Congo. On the 21st of February 1961, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 161, granting the mandate to restore order, avert an impending civil war, and ensure the immediate arrest and departure of all foreign military personnel and mercenaries from the country. However, the Katangese government disregarded the resolution and formulated plans to quell the rebellion in its northern region. You see, the Baluba population residing in northern Katanga had been opposed to Tshombe's secession from the very beginning. This area was the stronghold of the political party known as the Balubakat. It was led by a man by the name of J.C. Senwe. Since October 1960, northern Katanga had been designated as a neutral zone under the control of UNOC contingents. But in reality, the UN troops stationed there were too weak to effectively exercise their authority. Previously, the Balubakat rebels had mistakenly ambushed an 11-man section of Irish UNOC troops at Niembe, resulting in the unfortunate death of 9 Irish soldiers. The rebels had mistaken the UN troops for mercenaries affiliated with the Katangese Gendarmerie. Towards the end of February, Moise Tshombe began an offensive to suppress the Baluba opposition in northern Katanga. He deployed approximately 5,000 troops from his Katangese Gendarmerie to Lubudi. Simultaneously, they aimed to retake the town of Manono, secure the southern area, and launched attacks from Kabalo in Albertville in the east and Congolo in the north. Leading the Balubakat rebels in Manono was a man by the name of Laurent Desire Kabila. Subsequently, the Katangese Gendarmerie launched Operation Banquets, Mambo, and Lotus against the Balubakat rebels and successfully captured Manono in March. Following this, the Katangese Gendarmerie then redirected their focus to Kabalo, but the town was occupied by UNOC troops from Ethiopia. On April the 7th, a Katangese plane carrying 30 mercenaries attempted to secure the town's airstrip, but when they landed, they were promptly apprehended by the UNOC troops. In the meantime, Katangese ground forces, commanded by Colonel Jean-Marie Crevecoeur, continued to engage the Balubakat militia. They encountered formidable resistance from the Balubakat rebels, which hindered their repeated attempts to enter the city of Kabalo. Eventually, on the 11th of April, Katangese troops withdrew from the area and shifted their focus to operations further south. On August the 2nd, Cyril Adula succeeded Joseph Ilio as Prime Minister of the Kasavubu Mobutu government in Leopoldville. He adopted a significantly more assertive approach towards resolving the Katangese secession. That same month, Antoine Gizenga, the leader of the Free Republic of the Congo, consented to rejoin the Congolese government as Deputy Prime Minister, following extensive negotiations between the two parties. However, he opted to remain in Stanleyville. Following the latest mandate from the UN Security Council, UNOC officials made efforts to secure cooperation from the Katangese government regarding the expulsion of mercenaries from Katanga. Unfortunately, they faced limited progress as Tshombe and his subordinates actively resisted the departure of the foreign troops. After careful consideration of the situation, the UN Secretariat concluded that if Tshombe failed to comply with their request, foreign officers of the Katangese Gendarmerie would be forcibly arrested and deported. The UN officials hoped that a display of force would persuade the Katangese government to cooperate. However, Tshombe remained undeterred. As a result, the UN began to plan a military operation codenamed Operation Rum Punch, targeted towards the foreign gendarmes. On August the 27th, Colonel Cruz O'Brien, the UN Special Representative in Katanga, convened a meeting with key ONOC commanders in Elizabethville to outline plans for the arrest of foreign military personnel in Katanga. The strategy involved seizing the post office and radio station, followed by establishing a cordon around the residence of the Katangese Minister of Interior, Godfred Monongo, to impede any coordinated resistance from the Katangese. Originally scheduled for August the 29th, the operation was advanced by 24 hours to maintain tactical surprise as directed by its commander, Brigadier General K.A.S. Raja. At about 4 a.m. on August the 28th, Operation Rum Punch began. 2 companies of the Indian Regiment seized control of the radio station, resulting in the arrest of 2 Belgian mercenaries. Simultaneously, Ghanaian troops surrounded a mercenary camp near the shores of Lake Tanganyika in northeastern Katanga. This camp was commanded by a French mercenary by the name of Bob Denard. Denard's men initially desired to fight, but they received radio orders to surrender. By the end of the day, 81 foreign members of the Katangese Gendarmerie had been apprehended and taken to the Kamina Air Base to await deportation. Operation Rum Punch had come to an end, but still, numerous foreign officers managed to evade deportation. One notable example was a French Lieutenant Colonel by the name of Roger Fricke, who now assumed the position of Chief of Staff of the Katangese Army. Since Operation Rum Punch did not bring an end to the mercenary crisis in Katanga, several ONOC officials began to devise a more forceful operation to assert their authority. On September the 13th, ONOC initiated Operation Mortar. This intensified operation, building upon the foundation of Rum Punch, would trigger a significant 8-day military clash between the UN troops and the Katangese forces. This time, Tshombe's mercenaries were well prepared and mounted successful counterattacks, resulting in the loss of 13 UN troops and over 200 Katangese civilians and soldiers. While UN forces managed to seize various outposts around Elizabethville and made attempts to apprehend Tshombe, miscommunications amongst their commanders allowed Tshombe to evade capture and escape to northern Rhodesia. As Operation Mortar unfolded, Katangese soldiers launched a counterattack on an isolated unit of Irish UN troops in the mining town of Jadoteville. This significant event came to be known as the Siege of Jadoteville. Consisting of 155 men, the Irish A Company, under the command of Colonel Pat Quillan, had been deployed to Jadoteville a few weeks earlier to assist in safeguarding the town's residents. But at about 7:40 a.m. on Wednesday, September the 13th, Katangese soldiers launched a sudden assault on the Irish troops who were attending an open-air mass. Private Billy Reddy, an Irish centurion, detected the threat and fired a warning shot, alerting the company to the impending attack. Consequently, the Katangese gendarmes launched repeated attacks, sending waves of about 600 troops while subjecting the Irish positions to heavy bombardment from 81mm mortars. However, the fire from the Irish positions proved effective, enabling them to neutralize most of the Katangese mortar and artillery positions. These intense fightings persisted for 5 days, during which a small relief force consisting of Irish, Indian, and Swedish troops made valiant attempts to reach the besieged soldiers in Jadoteville. Regrettably, the Katangese gendarmes, led by French, German, Belgian, and South African mercenaries, repelled their advances. Outgunned and outnumbered by the Katangese, the besieged Irish soldiers radioed their headquarters.
"We will hold out until our last bullet is spent. Could do with some whiskey."
By now, the Katangese forces had suffered significant losses and approached Quinlan to propose a ceasefire. Quinlan accepted the offer. However, the lack of communication between Quinlan and his superiors resulted in a violation of the ceasefire agreement by the Katangese. Lacking ammunition and food, and with no clear orders or promise of assistance from his superiors, Quinlan and his A Company surrendered to the Katangese on Sunday, September 17th, 1961. The Irish soldiers were taken hostage for approximately 1 month before their eventual release. Remarkably, throughout the siege, soldiers from the Irish A Company inflicted around 1,300 casualties, including 300 fatalities on the Congolese forces, without suffering any losses within their ranks. Onok's acts of violence during Operation Mortar did not sit well with the international community. As a result, UN Secretary Dag Hammarskjöld began plans to negotiate a ceasefire between the UN forces and the Katangese troops. Unfortunately, tragedy struck on September the 18th while he was on his way to Northern Rhodesia to meet with Moise Tshombe. His Douglas DC-6 airliner crashed near Ndola, killing him and all 15 other passengers on board. The circumstances during the crash raised suspicions, leading to speculations about a possible foul play or sabotage. However, a 1962 Rhodesian inquiry attributed it to pilot error. A few days later, a ceasefire was established between the two parties, and Tant assumed the role of the new Secretary General of the United Nations. In stark contrast to Hammarskjöld's moderate approach in the Congo, Tant endorsed a more radical stance and called for direct involvement in the conflict. On the morning of Saturday, November the 11th, two C-119 aircraft manned by the Italian aircrew of Onok took off from the capital city of Leopoldville en route to Port-en-Pain, Kindu. They were tasked with providing supplies for the small Malaysian unit responsible for controlling the airfield in that area. Due to the unrest caused by Gizenga's troops moving from Stanleyville towards Katanga, the region posed a significant danger for the Europeans. However, the Italian aircrew did not plan to stay there for too long, except for unloading the aircraft and having a brief lunch before flying back to base. In the days leading up to this, tensions had been unusually high amongst Gizenga's soldiers in the region. The Stanleyville troops, located 500 kilometers to the south in northern Katanga, had been targeted by Katangese aircraft bombings for months. Rumors had also begun to circulate about an impending airdrop by the Katangese army. Shortly after 2 p.m., the Congolese soldiers spotted the two Italian aircraft in the sky, intensifying their fear and suspicion. Upon landing, Gizenga's troop, comprising men from the 20th Stanleyville Battalion, jumped into trucks bound for the airfield. When they arrived, the 12 Italian aircrews and their commanding officer, Major Amadio Pemegiani, were having lunch with the leader of the Malaysian garrison. Facing assault from the Congolese soldiers, the Italians tried to barricade themselves in the building but were soon overpowered and taken prisoner. The first to die was medic Tenente Remolti, who was shot while trying to escape. The remaining 12 were brutally assaulted and loaded into 2 trucks. The entire Italian aircrew was then finished off at docks and then cannibalized by a local crowd. They had been falsely accused of aiding the Katangese secessionists. Throughout October and November, Tshombe continued to reinforce the Katangese gendarmerie with additional mercenaries, ammunition, and aircraft. The UN had become increasingly enraged with the continued Katangese resistance and their unwillingness to hand over their mercenaries even after Operations Rum Punch and Mortar. As a result, on November the 24th, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 169 rejecting Katanga's claim to statehood and authorizing the peacekeeping troops to use all necessary force to assist the central government in restoring and maintaining law and order. Furthermore, the Council authorized the Secretary General to take whatever action necessary to immediately apprehend and deport all foreign military personnel and prevent their return.
Certainly, every reasonable step should be taken to prevent the gendarmerie from becoming a lawless and undisciplined military organization.
4 days later, a skirmish broke out between the Indian ONOC troops and the Katangese gendarmes at the Elizabethville airport, resulting in the detention and disarmament of the Katangese soldiers. As a result, the gendarmes saw this as the beginning of a new ONOC offensive and mounted a roadblock along the route to the Swedish ONOC camp in Elizabethville. ONOC's military commander for South Katanga, Colonel Ewans called numerous Katangese officials to have the road cleared, but he received evasive responses. The next day, gendarmes attacked and killed a Swedish soldier, injuring 2 others when they attempted to pass through the roadblock. In response, Ivan Smith, the UN representative, issued warnings to all Katangese forces, urging them to withdraw to their barracks. But once more, the Katangese authorities ignored the warning. On the 4th of December, Smith and the commander of all UN forces in Katanga, Brigadier K.A.S. Raja, visited various ONOC outposts and encouraged patience amongst the troops. They emphasized that no action could be taken against the Katangese forces without the permission of the Security Council. But soon, they were completely gobsmacked to realize that the Katangese gendarmes had set up 3 additional roadblocks, effectively isolating them from the city center. After numerous phone calls from Smith, Evariste Kimba, the Katangese foreign minister who assumed government responsibilities in Tshombe's absence, made a promise to remove the roadblocks by 6 p.m. However, by the following morning, it became evident to the UN forces that the roadblocks would remain and that Kimba had no authority over the Katangese gendarmerie. Furthermore, the Katangese forces began to use the roadblocks to isolate ONOC camps from each other and cut off the UN position at the airport. Following this, Othen became convinced that urgent military action should be taken to restore ONOC's freedom of movement. Immediate orders were issued to Raja and his troops began taking up positions in proximity to the Katangese roadblocks. At about 12:15 p.m. on December the 5th, UN troops stationed in Katanga launched Operation UNOCAT. The operation was aimed at securing freedom of movement for ONOC personnel. In the initial phase, Indian ONOC troops, under the command of Brigadier K.A.S. Raja, launched an attack to dismantle the gendarmerie roadblock on the highway between their location and Elizabethville. With the support of Irish and Swedish troops, they successfully cleared the road using armored cars. Following this achievement, the troops proceeded to establish their own roadblock. However, when a platoon led by Captain Gobachan Salaria attempted to link up with the roadblock, they were assaulted by 19 gendarmes accompanied by 2 armored vehicles. Displaying exceptional bravery, Salaria and his troops engaged in a bayonet charge, driving the gendarmes from their positions. As a result, the Katangese suffered immense losses compared to the Indians. But tragically, Salaria did not survive the operation. That same day, A Katangese plane bombed the Elizabethville airport while the Irish contingent's camp came under heavy sniper fire. In response, ONOC's Canberra bombers conducted a raid on the Kowezi airstrip, destroying several Katangese aircraft in the process. Over the following days, the UN troops continued to launch attacks on multiple targets across Katanga. The troops focused on specific locations aiming to disrupt Katangese reinforcement efforts, and by December the 8th, they had achieved air superiority over Katanga. Subsequently, on December the 15th, UN troops initiated a comprehensive offensive to seize control of the center of Elizabethville and block the Katangese escape routes to the west. Throughout the evening and the following day, the Ethiopian contingent fought through the Lido area, effectively obstructing Katangese escape paths to Kipuchi and Rhodesia. Simultaneously, Irish and Swedish troops secured the industrial district and formulated a major assault targeting Camp Marciat, the primary base of the Katangese Gendarmerie. In the early hours of Saturday, December the 16th, a torrential tropical downpour engulfed the heavily fortified main base of the Katangese Gendarmerie at Camp Marciat. Despite the challenging condition, ONOC troops commanded by Colonel Ewans decided to launch an assault on the camp. At the time of the attack, 3 companies of the Katangese Gendarmerie were stationed there. The attack began at about 3:40 a.m. The UN troops, consisting of the Swedish and the Irish battalions, initiated a 35-minute bombardment of the camp using mortars. Following the intense mortar barrage, a relentless shower of about 940 grenades rained down upon the camp. Although the Katangese responded with heavy fire from mortars, machine guns and snipers positioned on the upper floors of the buildings, the UN troops continued to press forward. Eventually, the Swedish unit managed to seize control of the main entrance. However, the gendarmes regrouped and launched a fierce counterattack, engaging the Swedes in intense hand-to-hand combat. Nevertheless, by 1 p.m., the Swedes successfully repelled all attacks and asserted complete control over the Katangese stronghold. Resultingly, by December the 18th, ONOC troops had nearly complete control of Elizabethville, with the exception of Chombe's presidential palace and the headquarters of the Belgian mining company, Union Minière. Thereafter, Othen declared a unilateral temporary ceasefire, prompting Chombe to begin negotiations with the central government. On the 20th of December, with guarantees of protection from the United States and the United Nations, Chombe agreed to meet with representatives of the Congolese central government at the Kitona Air Base. At about 2:30 a.m. the following day, Chombe agreed to sign an 8-point document called the Kitona Declaration. This declaration effectively renounced Katanga's secession. Upon receiving news of Chombe's signature, Tant confirmed the UN ceasefire. However, Chombe would later postpone this agreement and delay any reconciliatory actions. Meanwhile, in Stanleyville, Gizenga and his troops faced intense pressure from the central government and the UN following the murder of the 13 Italian ONOC troops in Kindu. In early January 1962, the Congolese parliament passed a resolution demanding Gizenga's return to Leopoldville, the disbandment of his militia, and the establishment of a special commission to restore central authority in the Oriental province. But Gizenga refused to budge an inch. Consequently, clashes broke out between the central forces and Gizenga's loyalists, resulting in multiple fatalities. However, order was finally restored after ONOC troops intervened. Thereafter, Londola's forces promptly surrounded Gizenga's residence and placed him under house arrest. Now stripped of his vice premiership, Kizinga was eventually imprisoned, marking the end of his free republic in the Congo. Similarly, the downfall of South Kasai will begin 3 months later in April 1962 after the UN troops occupied the region as part of Othen's aggressive stance against secession. Its leader, Albert Kalonji, who had previously been imprisoned, escaped and returned to the region, aiming to regain its official position as the head of the Kasayan government. However, in September 1962, dissatisfied military commanders in South Kasai, influenced by their former Prime Minister Joseph Ngalula, staged a coup against Kalonji and placed him under house arrest. Kalonji would once again escape, fleeing to Katanga before ultimately settling in Spain. Finally, in October 1962, central government troops entered the capital city of Bakwanga, effectively marking the end of the secessionist state of South Kasai. Back in Katanga, it had become evident to the UN that Tshombe had no intention of rejoining the Congo. The number of mercenaries in Katanga had increased to about 500 and new airfields and defensive positions were being constructed. Furthermore, ONOC personnel continued to face increasing harassment at the hands of the Katangese gendarmes. The situation reached a breaking point on December the 24th when the Katangese brazenly attacked the Ethiopian peacekeeping force and shot down an unarmed ONOC helicopter. Responding to the growing hostility from the Katangese forces, the UN Security Council authorized a retaliatory offensive aimed at securing Elizabethville and crushing the Katangese secession. The offensive was codenamed Operation Grand Slam. Under the command of Major General Dewan Premchand, Operation Grand Slam commenced on the afternoon of December the 28th. The operation, originally planned in 3 phases, was ultimately completed in 2. On the first day of the operation, UN forces killed about 50 gendarmes, successfully securing downtown Elizabethville, the local gendarmerie headquarters, the radio station, and Tshombe's presidential palace. The next day, ONOC Air Division launched a surprise assault on the Kowezi airfield. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian unit advanced along the Kipushi Road to sever the Katangese communication lines in Rhodesia. During the night, Irish troops captured the town of Kipushi without encountering any opposition. With subsequent assistance from the Malaysian and Nigerian ONOC forces, the UN peacekeeping troops successfully secured the final Katangese stronghold in Kowezi. Consequently, on the 15th of January 1963, Tshombe formally sent a message to Tant.
I'm ready to immediately proclaim before the world that Katanga's secession is over.
2 days later, on January the 17th, he met with UN officials in Elizabethville and signed a formal instrument of surrender, officially bringing an end to the Katangese secession.
Une victoire militaire totale de l'ONU ne peut finalement pas bénéficier au peuple congolais. Par conséquent, nous sommes prêts à proclamer immédiatement devant le monde que la sécession katangaise est terminée.
Thereafter, a new constitution called the Low Labor Constitution was established. It expanded the powers of the presidency, abolished the system of joint consultation between the president and the prime minister, and increased the number of provinces from 6 to 21. The country was also renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Subsequently, Tshombe would go into exile in northern Rhodesia before settling in Spain. Similarly, his remaining gendarmes would be relegated to neighboring Angola. Following Katanga's integration, UN forces in the Congo significantly reduced, leaving only a small peacekeeping contingent in the country. However, the final group of peacekeepers departed on the 30th of June 1964. The last ONUG soldier to leave the Congo was the Nigerian UN Force Commander, Major General Johnson Agwei Ironsi. While the fall of Katanga brought an end to the secessionist movement, it did not completely resolve the underlying issues that fueled the conflict. The Democratic Republic of the Congo would continue to grapple with the enduring legacy of division and mistrust, exerting a profound influence on its political landscape. Within a few months after Katanga's fall, the Congo would be plunged into the throes of two significant rebellions, shaking the very foundations of its regional stability. On January 17, 1961, Patrice Emery Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was assassinated. Consequently, many of his supporters fled the country's capital of Leopoldville and sought refuge in the city of Stanleyville, where Lumumba had significant recognition. One of them was his former Deputy Prime Minister, Antoine Gizenga. Upon arrival, Gizenga and fellow Lumumbists consolidated power and organized a new government in Stanleyville called the Free Republic of the Congo. This new government garnered support from China and the Soviet Union. At the time, the Congo was plunged into crisis after its army mutinied and two of its prominent regions seceded. However, by early 1963, the rebellion was suppressed with the assistance of foreign intervention, notably from the United Nations. Gizenga was subsequently arrested and his government dissolved, prompting many of his supporters to seek exile in neighboring Congo-Brazzaville. In Brazzaville, this group began to take practical measures to initiate an armed struggle and regain control of the Congo. Led by prominent Lumumbists Christophe Benye, Gaston Sumalo, and Bochari Davidson, they established a revolutionary organization called the National Liberation Council, CNL. After prolonged instability and a corrupt and inefficient government, the CNL began advocating for a second independence to overthrow the neo-colonial regime in the Congo. Without delay, the organization initiated plans for a revolt in the country's eastern parts, targeting specifically the Kivu and the Oriental provinces, as well as parts of North Katanga, which were previously under Gizenga's control. Assigned to carry out the rebellion in northern Katanga was a man by the name of Laurent Desire Kabila. In the meantime, Gaston Sumilo journeyed to the neighboring Burundi and recruited thousands of troops with the support of the Burundian government. He begins plans for the invasion of the Congo from South Kivu. But whilst these plans for a rebellion were being developed, Pierre Mulele, another ardent supporter of Lumumba and Gizenga, recently returned from military training in China and started recruiting men to launch a revolution in his native province of Kwilu. Recruiting men from his native ethnic group, the Mbunda, as well as from Gizenga's Pende, he launched an armed revolt against the central government beginning in late 1963 called the Kwilu Rebellion. Mulele's uprising will give the CNL the much-needed boost, as shortly after, Sumialot forces would enter South Kivu, overpower its defenses, and begin a much larger revolt called the Simba Rebellion. On January 16, 1964, conflict broke out in the cities of Idiofa and Gonku in the Kwilu province. What initially started as a small insurgency the previous year had now grown into a full-blown rebellion. Rebels led by Pierre Mulele carried out attacks on many religious, government, and industrial institutions throughout Kwilu. This resulted in the deaths of many Congolese. Things took a turn for the worse on the 5th of February when Mulele's men ambushed and killed a Congolese army chief. As a result, the Congolese government declared a state of emergency in the Kwilu province. Mulele's forces, despite being poorly armed, made extensive use of witchcraft to demoralize their opponents. They also adopted tactics reminiscent of the Chinese Revolution, following a strict moral code and emphasizing respect for civilians, an ideology they called Colonialism. As the fightings continued, several non-Congolese in the region began to flee the country. At the time, the United Nations operation in the Congo, ONUC, a peacekeeping mission tasked with maintaining law and order during the secessionist crisis, was in the process of withdrawing its troops from the Congo. However, they managed to mobilize a small contingent of peacekeepers to the Kwilu province with the specific objective of rescuing some Western missionaries. About 100 missionaries were successfully recovered through this operation. Apart from this mission, ONUC played no further role in the rebellion. Following the initial success of the rebels, General Joseph Mobutu, the commander of the Congolese army, implemented a scorched earth policy against the Kwilu rebels. As a result, the Congolese army burned down many villages in Kwilu and brutally executed many civilians. In the nearby town of Kikwit, they executed more than 3,000 people. Leading this operation was one Colonel Joseph Muzimba, who callously dubbed the military camp under his command the National Butchery of the Kikwit. 16th April 1964. CNL rebels from the east, now referred to as the Simbas, a Swahili word for lion, entered South Kivu from Burundi through the plain of Ruzizi and made their way to the city of Bukavu. Armed with lists of targeted political figures, they killed a minimum of 8 civilians and 4 policemen. That same day, government forces attempted to regain control of the situation and managed to capture 13 Simbas, whom they promptly executed. On the 15th of May, Sumialot forces captured the city of Uriva. For 3 days, policemen, civil servants, and military personnel are subjected to a manhunt and killed on the spot. Rebel leader Colonel Louis Bidalira commanded the execution. The rebels then proceeded to capture the town of Bisi. Like their counterparts in Kwilu, the Simbas increasingly relied on magic to claim immunity to bullets and ensure their invisibility on the battlefield. Additionally, they incorporated a group of Rwanda exiles called the Inyenzis. Having made several unsuccessful attempts to reclaim their home country, the exiles joined the rebellion with the hope of receiving support for their endeavors in Rwanda from a Simba-led government. Lacking modern weapons, except for those acquired from the defeated or fleeing Congolese army, the Simbas recklessly charged into enemy lines, resulting in substantial casualties. However, this did not deter them from intimidating the government troops.
Vous vous considérez comme l'héritier et comme le vengeur de Patrice Lumumba. Comment est-ce que vous allez continuer sa politique?
Non, nous sommes les continuateurs de l'œuvre de Patrice Lumumba. Nous ne sommes pas des vengeurs. Parce que quand on fait la politique de vengeance, c'est une politique d'extermination. Nous ne sommes pas ici pour exterminer les ennemis de Patrice Lumumba. Mais nous sommes ici pour lutter contre le régime qui fait la honte de notre Congo.
On the 27th of May 1964, pro-Simba forces in the North Katanga city of Leopoldville, led by Laurent Desire Kabila, revolted against the provincial government of J.C. Sendwe. Sendwe, the former leader of the Balubakat party and president of the province of North Katanga, was accused of embezzling public funds and detained. However, on the 30th of May, government troops led by Colonel Louis Bobozo successfully regained control of the town, rescuing Sendwe and killing about 250 rebels in the process. Sendwe suspected Prosper Wambalunga, his longtime rival and former provincial president, of orchestrating the rebellion and had him arrested. Then, on the 19th of June, the population revolted once again and successfully ousted the government. Exploiting the ensuing chaos, the Simbas captured the town of Albertville. Government forces fled, abandoning Sendwe, who was subsequently murdered by the rebels under unclear circumstances. Meanwhile, Christophe Gbengue, the leader of the CNL, spearheads the revolt in the northeastern part of the Congo. He organized his troops under the name of the People's Liberation Army, the APL, and placed them under the command of General Nicolas Olenga. By June, Olenga's men had successfully occupied North Kivu and a significant portion of the southern Oriental province. On the 22nd of July, they advanced into the province of Maniema and seized a strategically significant capital of Kindu. That same month, troops commanded by Kabila captured the city of Bodouanville and set about conquering the entire western shores of Lake Tanganyika. Consequently, the Congolese army responded with brutal counter-insurgency measures but ultimately failed to defeat the rebels. Soon, these growing insurgents attracted support from the Soviet Union and China. The Soviets sent weapons and military equipment to the rebels via cargo planes coming from neighboring Sudan. Unfortunately, this operation swiftly turned against them as Sudan soon became embroiled in its own civil war. Amid the ongoing successes of the Simbas, General Joseph Mobutu pressured President Joseph Kasavubu to dismiss Prime Minister Cyril Adoula and install a new government led by Moise Tshombe. Tshombe, the exiled leader of the former state of Katanga and a staunch enemy of Patrice Lumumba, was seen as the ideal leader to confront the Simbas. He was brought back from exile and officially appointed the new Prime Minister on the 10th of July 1964. The new Prime Minister immediately sought military aid from Western nations, recruited white mercenaries, and brought back his loyalist troops, the Katangese Gendarmerie, from exile in Angola. Seeking a government of reconciliation, he secures the release of about 600 political prisoners, including former Deputy Prime Minister Antoine Gizenga. Nevertheless, Tshombe's rise to power generated significant discontent within the Congo and other African countries. Meanwhile, the Simbas continued their menacing advance, this time towards the heart of the Oriental province. On August the 4th, terror struck the educated elite in Stanleyville as the city fell into the hands of the rebels under the command of General Nicolas Olenga. In the absence of their competent commander, Colonel Leonard Mulamba, the Congolese army in the city fled. The Simbas wasted no time and swiftly began the systematic execution of Congolese intellectuals. Anyone deemed to have adopted the Western way of life was murdered in front of a monument dedicated to Patrice Lumumba. The sheer brutality of the executions claimed the lives of several thousand Congolese. Rebel leader Alphonse Kingins, Olenga's second-in-command, led the executions. Unfortunately for the Simbas, Stanleyville's capture would become a magnet for Western intervention. In the following weeks, more large-scale executions would be carried out in Paulis and Wasta after the Simbas occupied the cities on the 19th and 24th of August, respectively. Afterward, General Olenga led his troops to Bukavu and attempted to capture the city. But after facing heavy resistance from the Congolese forces under the command of Colonel Mulamba, they retreated. Subsequently, Mulamba's troops initiated a systematic purge of Bukavu and its surrounding areas, leading to numerous summary executions. Tragically, many of the victims were Rwanda Tutsis suspected of supporting the Simbas. After the capture of Stanleyville, the Simbas established a state around the territories they occupied. They called it the People's Republic of the Congo. Led by Christophe Benye, the rebels now held control of over more than half of the entire Congo. However, despite their swift progress on the battlefield, the Simbas were unable to consolidate their gains and establish an alternative system of administration to replace the one they had effortlessly dismantled. In terms of military success, the Simbas outperformed their counterparts in Kwilu, but by prioritizing militarism over politics and preferring action over reflection, they had become much like the previous administrators they had sought to dismantle. Corruption and ethnic favoritism became liabilities for the rebel leaders, and soon, these burgeoning weaknesses would lead to their eventual collapse. With a significant portion of northern Congo under their control, the Simbas began advancing deeper into the province of Kasai. The control of Kasai up to the Angolan border would effectively split the government forces in half and isolate the province of Katanga. In August, the Simbas began the conquest of Kasai. As in previous encounters, the Congolese forces continued to retreat, with some defecting to join the rebels. Nevertheless, Moise Tshombe, the recently appointed Prime Minister, responds decisively to this new threat. He orders troops from the Katangese gendarmerie and a group of mercenaries to engage the rebels near Lualaba. Facing relentless bombardment from the federal troops, the Simbas suffered every casualties, prompting their retreat from Kasai. The sources in Kasai validates Tshombe's decision to employ Western mercenaries in enhancing the capabilities of his well-trained Katangese formations. Arguably, the most crucial figure among the mercenaries was a former British military officer by the name of Major Mike Orr, who had previously assisted Tshombe during the Katangese Rebellion, was the leader of a mercenary unit called the 5 Commando. Comprising about 300 men, many of whom were opportunistic white South Africans, Orr's 5 Commando would ultimately play a pivotal role in suppressing the rebellion. Following the triumph in Kasai, Tshombe ordered a combined offensive against the city of Leopoldville. Retaking the city would grant the Congolese army access to Lake Tanganyika and establish a strategic base for future offensives. On August the 24th, Major Mike Orr and his mercenaries led an assault on Leopoldville, codenamed Operation Wash Chain. They attacked the city with 30 men, followed by a coordinated assault by the Congolese army. However, by August the 28th, Orr's involvement in the operation ended in a disaster when his forces failed to reach their targets. Fortunately, the Congolese army took the city on the 30th of August and saved the lives of 135 Europeans. Together with the victory in Kasai, the recapture of Leopoldville provided stability to the government's southern flank. After the capture of Stanleyville by the Simbas, Belgian and American support for the Congolese government grew. Consequently, the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Paul Henri Spaak, appoints Colonel Frederik van der Wel as Tshombe's military advisor. Tshombe was particularly delighted with van der Wel's arrival, as they had previously worked together during the Katangese Rebellion. Tasked with organizing the Congolese army against the Simbas, van der Wel begins plans to recapture the rebel-held territory by attacking it from all sides. He created the 5th Mechanized Brigade, composed of 66 Belgian officers, 350 mercenaries, several thousand Congolese gendarmes, and troops from the Congolese army. Set up into 5 mobile columns, he names it after a Belgian procession, Wema. The new military advisor lays his plans as follows. The first column, Lima 1, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Albert Liégeois, would begin the assault on Stanleyville by driving north against the scattered resistance from Congolo through Kimbombo, seizing the town of Kindu in the process. After which, they will be reinforced by troops from the second column, Lima 2, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Lamoignon. Together, they will make their way towards Stanleyville from Mobutu. Before that, the northern column will begin their assault from Gemena to the rebel-held territories of Lisala and Bomba before finally reaching the town of Paulis. Similarly, the Shuapa column was tasked with recapturing the towns of Boinde and Ikela, and the last column from Bukavu was tasked with advancing northwards towards Bonia. By the end of September, the northern column reached Lisala and recaptured the city of Bomba on October the 16th. Also, the Shuapa column retook the town of Boinde on October the 24th. In Stanleyville, internal tensions began to arise amongst the Simbas. As the Congolese army continued its relentless advance, rebel leader Christophe Benye ordered the arrest of all foreigners residing within Simba-held territory. General Nicolas Olenga further corroborated this on October the 31st.
The Americans and Belgians must be kept in safe places. In case of bombing in the area, exterminate them without giving any explanation. Signed, General Olenga.
Known to be out of the city in the middle of the month, Benye returned to Stanleyville on October the 24th with a captured American missionary by the name of Dr. Paul Carlson. Accused of working with the CIA, Carlson became a symbol of hatred for the rebels. By the end of the month, the Simbas had arrested more than 1,000 European and US citizens, with a significant number held in Stanleyville's Hotel Victoria. With the highest number of captives being Belgians and Americans, Paul-Henri Spaak, the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs, travels to New York City in early November to meet with UN and American authorities. The Americans made no secret of their willingness to act. In utmost secrecy, a Belgian and American operation is decided. It will be an airborne operation under the codename Dragon Rouge. The Americans will provide the planes, a squadron of C-130s led by Colonel Brugas Gardwell of the United States Air Force, while the Belgians will provide the para-commandos led by Colonel Charles Laurent. The operation would see the United States employ 12 C-130 aircraft to transport a Belgian paratroop battalion of about 545 men from the Kleine Brogo Air Base in Belgium through Spain, the Ascension Island, Katanga's Kamina Air Base, and finally to the Stanleyville Airport. Furthermore, the airborne assault will also coincide with the arrival of Van der Waals Omegan Ground Forces composed of mercenary troops and a contingent of the Congolese army. After a month of frustrating delays, Omegang's Lima 1 began its advance from Congolo on November the 1st, seizing the town of Kindu on November the 5th. As Liégeois' men pushed the rebels back, they began to kill their hostages. As a result, the commander imposes on his column a sustained rhythm, progressing even at night. In so doing, he disrupts several ambushes and saves more than 300 hostages. For the next 2 weeks, an airlift brings to Kindu reinforcements, vehicles, and ammunition. Lieutenant Colonel Lamoigne's Lima 2 had just arrived. Together, They resumed their advance towards Stanleyville on November the 19th. After several battles with the rebels and the terrain, they reached the town of Mobutu, some 200 kilometers from Stanleyville, on November the 22nd. At about 5:30 p.m. the next day, the Omega troops left Mobutu for Stanleyville. On November the 17th, 12 American C-130 aircraft took off from Belgium's Colonial Air Base, passed through Spain, and landed on the British overseas territory in the middle of the Atlantic called the Ascension Island. On board, troops from the Belgian 1st Paratroopers Battalion. At Ascension, they prepared to carry out one of the largest rescue operations in history. Transferred to the Congolese air base in Kema on November the 22nd, news comes in the next day, green light from the Belgian authorities and the Congolese government. Tomorrow at dawn, they will jump on the Simisini air base in Stanleyville and rescue the European hostages. On the morning of November the 24th, 5 American C-130 planes dropped 320 Belgian paratroopers onto the airfield in Stanleyville. Additionally, a platoon of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division was tasked with safeguarding the aircraft while on ground. With air support from Cuban expatriate mercenaries, the paratroopers descended on the Simisini Air Base and prepared themselves to secure it before additional aircraft could land with more men and supplies. Soon, they were greeted with trace fire from Chinese 12.7mm anti-aircraft machine guns from the Simbas. At about 6 a.m., the hostages in the Stanleyville's Hotel Victoria were awakened by sounds of planes flying over the city. Speculation immediately arose about a Belgian paratroop drop. As a result, the guards at the hotel knocked on all doors and ordered all men, women and children down into the street. However, around 50 hostages managed to hide on the upper floors of the building. Half an hour later, Colonel Joseph Opepe, the rebel leader stationed at the hotel, leads about 250 hostages to the Simisini airport. After a short march, a truck of Simbas arrived from the airport, proclaiming that the Belgian paratroopers had landed and seized control of the airport. As a result, Colonel Opepe instructs the hostages to sit on the street. For about 2 to 3 minutes, considerable confusion ensued amongst the Simbas. By now, they could hear the sound of heavy gunfire from the approaching paratroopers. Suddenly, the bloodthirsty rebels unleashed as much carnage as possible by firing their automatic weapons at the seated hostages. The ordeal lasted for about 5 minutes. Subsequently, a platoon of paratroopers led by Lieutenant Mertens arrived at the scene. They ran into a pickup truck full of Simbas and immediately opened fire, killing several rebels and wounding others. Mertens then secured the location before moving his platoon to the Hotel Victoria. He deploys 2 sections to cover his movement and took another inside to search the hotel. They found the 50 hostages who had remained hidden and brought them out. Once assembled, Mertens sends them to the battalion command post before continuing his mission. Then, at about 11 a.m., the Omega troops arrived at Stanleyville and established communications with the Belgian paratroopers. Lieutenant Colonel Leopold Lima I penetrated the city and controlled the Shopo Bridge. Similarly, Lieutenant Colonel Lamoignis Lima II occupied the 2 main rebel camps in the city.
Survivors are gathered up for evacuation. Not all are white. Sima fury is directed also against Congolese loyal to the government. Refugees gather at the airport waiting to be airlifted to Leopoldville. Every hour brings word of new atrocities beyond the slaughter of the first 29 found in downtown Stanleyville. Paratroops pressing on to other cities find similar grim evidence. Reports of the number of dead or wounded leap almost every...
Out of the 250 hostages ordered on the streets, 18 tragically lost their lives, while 40 sustained severe injuries. Amongst those killed during the raid was the American missionary Dr. Paul Carson, who was gunned down while attempting to take cover over a nearby wall.
Mon frère a été tué à côté de moi.
Et vos enfants?
L'aîné a eu une éraflure de balle juste sur le cuir chevelu, mais très superficielle.
Oh, nous n'avions pas de chez nous, notre chez nous c'était au Congo, hein. On verra, on se débrouillera.
In the end, more than 1,800 non-Congolese, along with about 400 Congolese individuals, were successfully evacuated. Operation Dragon Rouge was finally over. Despite the success of the raid, the Congolese Prime Minister Moise Tshombe faced heavy criticism from the international community for involving Belgian and US troops. They saw it as another act of imperialism. Nevertheless, Stanleyville's fall dealt a significant blow to the Eastern insurrection, from which the Simbas never fully recovered. Subsequently, General Joseph Mobutu, the Congolese army chief, arrived and ordered the cleansing of the city. His forces executed many Simbas and destroyed the Lumumba monument. In December, Mobutu's men captured and killed the rebel leader Alphonse Kingins and dumped his body on the ruins of the Lumumba monument, the same place where he had ordered the execution of Congolese intellectuals back in August. Two days after Operation Dragon Rouge, the Belgians and the Americans launched another assault on the Polish airstrip 280 kilometers northeast of Stanleyville. Codenamed Operation Dragon No, the paratroopers managed to rescue about 375 European hostages, but tragically lost around 20 to the Simbas. Coming under international pressure, Operation Dragon No would mark the end of direct American and Belgian intervention in the rebellion. In a tragic turn of events, the Simba forces who had fled from Polis arrived at Watsa and brutally murdered several European hostages there. This included 9 nuns and 6 missionaries. Despite the dispersal of the main rebel forces, Eastern Congo remained largely under Simba control, with numerous hostages still held captive. As a result, General Mobutu assigns Major Mike Orr's 5 Commando to recapture and secure the border areas with Uganda and Sudan. In January 1965, Major Mike Orr and his men launched Operation White Giant, which saw the recapture of the cities of Aru, Aba, Faraje, and Watsa. Though the Simbas demonstrated their capability as a formidable fighting force by inflicting significant defeats on the Congolese army near Bafwasende and Bomba, the rebels had become too weak to resume their offensive and were unable to exploit their defensive successes. However, help would come for the rebels in April 1965 in the person of Ernesto Che Guevara. The Argentine-born Cuban revolutionary arrived in the Congo with mostly black Cuban volunteers aiming to bring about a Cuban-style revolution and overthrow the Congolese government. Initially collaborating with guerrilla leader Laurent Desire Kabila, Guevara found the rebels to be seemingly undisciplined. Nevertheless, he continued to train them, leading to improved performance and well-organized ambushes against the Congolese army. Unfortunately, whilst Guevara tried to conceal his presence, the CIA knew his location, monitored his communications, and anticipated his attacks. After 7 months of defeats, inactivity, and a declining health, he reluctantly left the Congo with his Cuban comrades on the 20th of November 1965.
We cannot liberate, all by ourselves, a country that does not want to fight.
Subsequently, the Congolese army and its mercenaries launched a multi-pronged campaign against the Simba strongholds of Fiji and Baraka, recapturing the cities and resulting in the deaths of over 215 rebels. The final Simba stronghold near Bukavu resisted for a month, but it was eventually captured after the Simbas had killed several thousand civilians. By the end of the rebellion, the Simbas had executed over 20,000 Congolese and 392 Westerners. After their defeat, Kabila and Sumialo continued to support the remaining insurgents from their exile in Tanzania, while Benye and Olenga became businessmen in Sudan and Uganda. The Kwilu Rebellion, on the other hand, persisted until December 1965. However, the rebels could not expand beyond their initial base, and hunger and disease had spread throughout the province, leading to a decline in the support for the rebellion. In the end, it claimed the lives of over 60,000 civilians. Subsequently, rebel leader Pierre Mulele would go into exile in Congo-Brazzaville. The end of the Simba Rebellion saw the beginning of a new political conflict in the Congo. In March 1965, the Congo held its national elections, and Moise Tshombe's Convention Nationale Congolais, CONACO, secured a large majority of seats. Tensions escalated as a significant part of Tshombe's party defected to form the new Front Democratique Congolais (FDC). Resultingly, CONACO gained control of the Chamber of Deputies, while the FDC took charge of the Senate. Attempting to exploit the situation, Congolese President Joseph Kasavubu deposed Tshombe and appointed Evariste Kimba of the FDC as Prime Minister. Kimba, who had previously served as Tshombe's Minister of Foreign Affairs during the Katanga Rebellion, faced resistance as the pro-Tshombe parliament refused to ratify his appointment. Instead of seeking a compromise candidate, Kasavubu once again overruled the parliament and unilaterally declared Kimba as Prime Minister. However, the parliament rejected Kimba for a second time. This political deadlock created the perfect opportunity for the army chief, General Joseph Mobutu, to seize power in a bloodless coup on November 25, 1965. Consequently, Mobutu appointed the competent Colonel Leonard Mulamba as Prime Minister, but later deposed him after abolishing the post the following year. He then reduced the number of provinces and their autonomy, resulting in a highly centralized state. Subsequently, Tshombe fled the country a second time and found refuge in Spain after being charged with treason. In the end, Mobutu gradually consolidated its control in the Congo, establishing himself as the embodiment of political power. As the years went on, he strengthened his hold on power by suppressing the opposition and maintaining an iron grip on the country for the next 3 decades.